Millionaire saw girl selling his lost daughter's teddy bear. "It was my father's," the girl said. He then discovered the truth that made him live again. The October rain drummed against the windows of Richard Wellington's black limousine as it crawled through downtown Chicago traffic. At 45, Richard had everything money could buy, yet his heart felt as empty as the mansion he called home. His steel-gray eyes stared blankly at the city streets, seeing nothing but the endless parade of his lonely existence. "Sir, there's a bit of congestion ahead," his driver, Thomas, announced through the intercom. Richard barely acknowledged him. He was returning from another pointless board meeting at Wellington Industries, another day of making millions while feeling absolutely nothing. 8 years had passed since his world shattered into a million pieces, and he built walls around his heart so high that nothing could reach him anymore. The rain grew heavier, matching the storm that perpetually raged inside his chest. He tried everything to fill the void: expensive vacations, luxury cars, even dating women who only wanted his money. Nothing worked. Nothing could replace what he'd lost. As the limousine slowed to a crawl near Lincoln Park, something caught his attention through the rain-streaked window. On the sidewalk, beneath a flickering streetlight, sat a small figure hunched on a worn cardboard box. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, with tangled blonde hair and clothes that had seen far better days. Before her, spread on a tattered blanket, was an array of toys: dolls with missing limbs, broken toy cars, and stuffed animals with matted fur. But it wasn't just any collection of toys that made Richard's breath catch in his throat and his heart stop beating for several terrifying seconds. There, sitting prominently among the other items like a beacon calling to him from his past, was a small brown teddy bear with a distinctive red bow tie and a missing left ear. Richard's hands began to shake uncontrollably. His breathing became shallow as memories flooded back like a dam bursting open after years of holding back an ocean of grief. Sarah's teddy bear. His daughter's most precious possession, the one she'd clutched every single night until that horrible day when everything changed forever. "Stop the car," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. "Sir? I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Stop the car now." Richard's voice cracked with raw emotion, surprising even himself. The limousine pulled over immediately, and Richard stumbled out into the cold October rain. His expensive Italian leather shoes splashed through dirty puddles as he approached the little girl with trembling legs. She looked up at him with the most beautiful emerald green eyes he'd ever seen, eyes that reminded him so painfully of Sarah's that his chest tightened with grief. "Hello there," Richard said gently, kneeling down despite his $1,000 Armani suit getting completely soaked. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma," the girl replied, her voice small but surprisingly brave for someone so young. "Are you here to buy something, mister?" "Everything's real cheap. I really need to help my grandma with her medicine." Richard's eyes remained fixed on the teddy bear, unable to look away. Every single detail was exactly as he remembered: the faded brown fur worn smooth from countless hugs, the crooked stitching where 7-year-old Sarah had operated on it with her toy doctor kit, even the tiny chocolate stain from the ice cream she'd spilled on it the day before the accident. "That teddy bear," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't control. "Where did you get it, honey?" Emma picked up the bear protectively, holding it close to her chest. "This is Mr. Button's. My daddy gave him to me when I was little, but—" Her little face crumpled with sadness that no child should ever have to carry. "But what, sweetheart? He went away when I was just a tiny baby. Grandma says he couldn't handle being a daddy, so he left me and never came back. But he gave me Mr. Button's before he went away." Emma's eyes filled with tears that broke Richard's heart. "I don't want to sell him, but Grandma's really, really sick, and her medicine costs so much money." Richard felt the world spinning dangerously around him. The teddy bear that had disappeared with his daughter 8 long years ago was here, in the small hands of this precious child whose father had abandoned her. Thunder rumbled overhead as a terrible, impossible thought began to form in Richard's mind. Could it possibly be? Emma. he said carefully, trying to keep his voice steady. What's your daddy's name? David, she whispered, looking down at her worn sneakers. David Parker. But please don't try to find him, mister. Grandma says some people are just too broken inside to love anyone properly. The name hit Richard like a physical blow to his chest. David Parker, the 25-year-old drunk driver who had slammed into his car 8 years ago, killing his beloved daughter Sarah instantly, and then disappeared after posting bail while awaiting trial. As the rain poured down even harder, Richard stared at this beautiful, innocent little girl holding his dead daughter's teddy bear, and realized that his entire life was about to change forever. Richard's mind reeled as he stared at Emma, who clutched Mr. Buttons tighter against her small chest. The rain continued to pour, but he barely felt it anymore. 8 years of carefully constructed walls around his heart were crumbling with each passing second. How much? Richard asked quietly, pulling out his wallet with trembling hands. For what, mister? Emma looked confused, her green eyes wide with innocence. For everything. All of it. Richard's voice was rough with emotion. How much for your grandmother's medicine? Emma's face lit up with hope, then quickly dimmed. The doctor said it's gonna cost $3,000 for the whole treatment. But I only made $12 so far. She gestured to the meager pile of coins beside her blanket. Richard pulled out a thick stack of hundreds, his hands still shaking. But as he counted the money, a terrible realization hit him. He couldn't just throw money at this situation and walk away. This little girl was connected to his daughter's death in ways that defied comprehension. David Parker, the man who had destroyed his life, had somehow given Sarah's teddy bear to his own daughter. Emma, sweetheart, where do you live? Where's your grandmother now? At Mercy General Hospital, Emma said, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Room 314. She's been there for 2 weeks now. The nurses are really nice, but they keep saying she needs the medicine soon or... Her voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Richard's heart shattered completely. This innocent child was facing the same kind of loss he'd endured, and he was powerless to prevent it, just like he'd been powerless to save Sarah. What's your grandmother's name? Margaret Thompson. But everyone calls her Nana Maggie. Emma smiled for the first time, her whole face transforming. She raised me all by herself after Daddy left. She's the best person in the whole world. Richard made a decision that would change everything. Emma, I want to help you and your grandmother. But first, I need to ask you something very important. Do you have any pictures of your father? Anything he might have left behind? Emma nodded eagerly. Nana Maggie has a box of his stuff in our apartment. She kept it just in case he ever came back, even though she doesn't think he will. Her expression grew sad again. Why do you want to know about my daddy? Did you know him? Richard's chest tightened. How could he possibly explain to this 7-year-old that her father had killed his daughter? That the teddy bear she treasured was stolen from the scene of a fatal accident? I might have known him a long time ago, Richard said carefully. Emma, would you like me to take you to see your grandmother? And maybe we could stop by your apartment first? Emma's eyes widened with excitement, but then doubt crept in. Nana Maggie always told me never to go anywhere with strangers. But you seem really nice, and you want to help us. She bit her lip, clearly torn between hope and caution. Richard knelt down to her level again, looking directly into her eyes. You're absolutely right to be careful, sweetheart. How about this? We'll call your grandmother first, and you can tell her about me. If she says it's okay, then I'll take you to see her. Deal? Emma nodded enthusiastically. Okay. But mister, I don't even know your name. Richard, he said softly. Richard Wellington. As Emma carefully packed up her toys, Richard stepped aside and called his lawyer on his cell phone. Marcus, it's Richard. I need you to research everything you can find about David Parker, the man who killed Sarah. I need to know if he had any family, any children, anything at all. Richard, what's this about? You know the case was closed years ago when he skipped bail. Just do it, Marcus. And I need it tonight. 20 minutes later, Richard found himself in the passenger seat of his limousine with Emma beside him, staring in wonder at the leather interior and electronic controls. She still held Mr. Buttons protectively, unaware that she was sitting next to the man whose daughter had originally owned that very bear. "This is the fanciest car I've ever seen!" Emma exclaimed, running her small hand along the smooth leather. "Are you like a movie star or something?" Richard managed a small smile despite the turmoil in his heart. "Something like that, sweetheart." As they drove toward Emma's apartment building in one of Chicago's rougher neighborhoods, Richard's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Found preliminary info. David Parker, 33 now. Had a daughter born 7 years ago to Jennifer Thompson. Mother died in childbirth. Child raised by maternal grandmother Margaret Thompson. More details coming." Richard's blood ran cold. Jennifer Thompson. The woman who had died bringing Emma into this world was David Parker's girlfriend. Which meant Emma was not just the daughter of the man who killed Sarah, she was an innocent victim of his abandonment, left to be raised by her grandmother after losing her mother. The layers of tragedy were overwhelming. David Parker had taken one life and destroyed countless others, including his own daughter's. As they pulled up to a rundown apartment building, Emma pointed excitedly to a third-floor window. "That's our place. Nana Maggie's gonna be so surprised when I tell her about the money for her medicine." But Richard was thinking about something else entirely. He was thinking about the box of David Parker's belongings that waited upstairs, and what secrets it might contain about the night Sarah died. Emma's apartment was small but meticulously clean, filled with the kind of warmth that only comes from unconditional love. Hand-crocheted doilies covered the worn furniture, and every surface displayed Emma's crayon drawings and school achievements. Richard felt like an intruder in this sacred space built by a grandmother's sacrifice and a little girl's hope. "This is where me and Nana Maggie live," Emma announced proudly, setting Mr. Buttons carefully on the faded floral couch. "She taught me to keep everything neat and tidy. She says a clean home makes a clean heart." Richard's throat tightened as he looked around. The apartment couldn't have been more than 600 square feet, but it radiated more love than his sprawling mansion ever had. Family photos covered one entire wall, Emma at various ages, always with a silver-haired woman who had kind eyes and a warm smile. "That's my Nana Maggie," Emma said, following his gaze. "She's the most beautiful person in the world, even when she's sick. She still tries to make me pancakes every morning, even though her hands shake now. She sounds wonderful," Richard said softly, his heart breaking for this child who was about to lose the only family she'd ever known. Emma disappeared into a small bedroom and returned dragging a cardboard shoebox. "This is Daddy's stuff. Nana Maggie showed it to me once, but she said it made her too sad to look at very often." Richard's hands trembled as Emma opened the box. Inside were a few photographs, some letters, a military dog tag, and a small leather journal. The first photograph made Richard's knees nearly buckle. It was David Parker, but not the monster Richard had imagined all these years. The young man in the photo was clean-cut, wearing an army dress uniform, with his arm around a beautiful woman with Emma's green eyes. Both were smiling with the kind of pure joy that comes from new love. "That's my mommy and daddy," Emma said quietly. "Nana Maggie says they loved each other very much, but sometimes love isn't enough when people are hurting inside." Richard picked up the military dog tag with shaking fingers. David M. Parker, U.S. Army, Iraq War veteran. The pieces were starting to come together in ways Richard had never expected. "Nana Maggie told me Daddy was a soldier," Emma continued, settling beside Richard on the couch. "He fought in a war far away, and when he came back, he was different. Sad all the time. She said the war broke something inside him that nobody knew how to fix." Richard opened the leather journal, and his heart stopped. The first entry was dated just 3 months before the accident that killed Sarah. "The nightmares are getting worse. I can't sleep, can't think straight. Jenny's worried about me, and the baby's coming soon. I want to be a good father, but I'm so messed up inside. Started drinking again yesterday. I hate myself for it, but it's the only thing that makes the memories stop. What kind of father will I be if I can't even take care of myself? Richard's hands shook as he turned the pages. Entry after entry detailed David's struggle with what was clearly severe PTSD, his love for Jennifer and his unborn daughter, and his growing dependence on alcohol to cope with his demons. The final entry was dated the night before the accident. Jenny died today. Our beautiful baby girl survived, but Jenny's gone. I can't handle this. I can't handle anything. I'm supposed to take care of Emma, but I can't even take care of myself. Margaret says she'll help, but how can I burden her with my broken life? I took one of Sarah's toys from the hospital. The nurses said it might help Emma bond with something familiar. But I don't deserve to be anyone's father. I'm going to have a drink and think about what to do. Richard's vision blurred with tears. For 8 years, he pictured David Parker as a heartless monster who had carelessly destroyed his family. But the truth was far more complex and tragic. David was a broken veteran who had lost the love of his life and couldn't cope with becoming a single father while battling his own demons. Mr. Richard? Emma's small voice brought him back to the present. Are you okay? You look really sad. Richard wiped his eyes quickly. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about some sad things that happened a long time ago. Emma climbed onto his lap with the innocent trust that only children possess. Nana Maggie says that sad things make us appreciate the happy things more. And she says that sometimes, when we think everything is broken, God sends us exactly what we need to make it better. Richard held this precious child, the daughter of the man who had killed his own daughter, and felt something shifting deep inside his chest. The rage and hatred he'd carried for 8 years was transforming into something else entirely, understanding, and perhaps even forgiveness. But there was still one more photograph in the box that would change everything. It was a picture of David Parker standing next to a small green car, the same car that had slammed into Richard's vehicle 8 years ago. But in the photo, mounted on the dashboard, Richard could see something that made his blood run cold. A car seat. An empty infant car seat that should have held Emma. Emma, Richard said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper. On the night your daddy left, where were you supposed to be? Emma looked thoughtful for a moment. Nana Maggie told me Daddy was supposed to take me to meet some important people that night. But at the last minute, she got a bad feeling and said I should stay with her instead. She said sometimes grandmothers just know things. Richard stared at the photograph, realizing the horrifying truth. If Emma had been in that car the night David Parker drove drunk, she would have died too. Margaret Thompson's intuition had saved Emma's life, and inadvertently created the tragic chain of events that brought her into Richard's world 8 years later. Is something wrong, Mr. Richard? Emma asked, noticing how quiet he'd become. Richard looked down at this beautiful, innocent child who had no idea that she should have died the same night as his daughter. 2 little girls, both victims of one man's broken mind and shattered heart. No, sweetheart, he whispered, holding her tighter. Nothing's wrong. But I think it's time we went to see your grandmother. Mercy General Hospital's pediatric wing bustled with evening activity as Richard and Emma walked hand in hand toward room 314. Emma had chatted excitedly during the entire car ride, telling Richard stories about her grandmother's legendary chocolate chip cookies and her habit of singing old country songs while doing dishes. But as they approached Margaret Thompson's room, Emma's steps slowed, and her grip on Richard's hand tightened. Sometimes Nana Maggie looks really sick, Emma whispered, her earlier enthusiasm fading. The tubes and machines scare me. But I pretend to be brave so she won't worry about me. Richard knelt down to Emma's level. You know what? I think your grandmother is lucky to have someone as brave as you. And you don't have to pretend with me, okay? If you're scared, that's perfectly normal. Emma nodded solemnly, then knocked gently on the door. Nana Maggie? It's me, Emma. And I brought a friend. The voice that answered was weak but filled with immediate warmth. "Come in, my precious girl. I've been waiting for you all day." Richard's breath caught as they entered the room. Margaret Thompson was clearly in the advanced stages of her illness. Her skin was pale and thin, and various monitors tracked her vital signs. But her eyes, the same brilliant green as Emma's, sparkled with intelligence and love as she saw her granddaughter. "There's my beautiful girl," Margaret said, opening her arms as Emma carefully climbed onto the bed for a gentle hug. "I was so worried when you didn't come this afternoon. I was working, Nana Maggie. Selling my toys to help pay for your medicine. And look," Emma gestured excitedly toward Richard. "This is Mr. Richard, and he wants to help us." Margaret's eyes shifted to Richard, and he saw a flicker of recognition pass across her face. She studied him carefully, her gaze moving from his expensive suit to his face, and Richard realized she was trying to place him. "Richard Wellington," he said softly, extending his hand. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Thompson." Margaret's intake of breath was sharp and sudden. Her eyes widened as the recognition fully hit her. "Oh my God!" she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. You're Sarah's father." The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Emma looked confused, glancing between the two adults who were staring at each other with obvious recognition. "You know each other?" Emma asked innocently. Richard and Margaret continued to lock eyes, years of pain and tragedy hanging heavy in the air between them. Margaret's heart monitor began beeping faster as her stress levels rose. "Mrs. Thompson," Richard said carefully, "perhaps Emma could go get some ice cream from the cafeteria while we talk?" Margaret nodded, never taking her eyes off Richard. "Emma, sweetheart, why don't you go downstairs and get us all some ice cream? Here's $5. She reached for her purse with trembling hands. "I'll pay for it," Richard said quickly, handing Emma a $20 bill. "Take your time, sweetheart. Get whatever you want." After Emma skipped out of the room, Margaret's composure crumbled. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she struggled to find words. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I am so incredibly sorry for what David did to your family. I've carried the guilt for 8 years, wondering if I could have done something, anything, to prevent that horrible night." Richard sank into the chair beside her bed, his own emotions overwhelming him. "Mrs. Thompson, Margaret, please. Margaret, I need you to know that I didn't come here for an apology. I came here because—" He paused, struggling with how to explain the impossible situation. "Because Emma has something that belonged to my daughter." Margaret's face went white. "Oh no. Oh God, no. What does she have?" "A teddy bear. Brown, with a red bow tie and a missing left ear. She calls it Mr. Buttons." Margaret closed her eyes, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "David brought it to her when she was just a few days old. He said he'd found it, and that it would help Emma feel less alone. I never questioned where it came from. I was so focused on helping him cope with Jennifer's death and his own struggles. I read his journal," Richard said quietly. "I understand now what he was going through. The PTSD, losing Jennifer, becoming a single father when he could barely take care of himself." Margaret nodded, her voice breaking. "He was such a good boy before the war. Gentle, kind, always helping his neighbors. But when he came back from Iraq, he was like a ghost of himself. The drinking started, the nightmares, the panic attacks. I begged him to get help, but he was too proud, too ashamed. What happened that night, Margaret? I need to know." Margaret took a shaky breath. "David was supposed to take Emma to meet Jennifer's parents for the first time. They lived about an hour away, and David had been drinking all day, grieving for Jennifer. I had a terrible feeling about it, a grandmother's intuition, I suppose. I insisted Emma stay with me that night." Richard's heart pounded. "So Emma was supposed to be in the car?" "Yes," Margaret whispered. "If I hadn't intervened, both little girls would have died that night. David would have killed himself, your precious Sarah, and his own daughter. The guilt of that realization has haunted me every single day since. The weight of the revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. Margaret Thompson had unknowingly saved Emma's life while being unable to save Sarah's. The interconnectedness of their tragedies was almost too much to comprehend. After the accident, Margaret continued, David disappeared completely. He never came back for Emma, never called, never sent money. I think the guilt and shame broke whatever was left of his mind. I raised Emma alone, and I've loved her with every fiber of my being. But I've always carried the knowledge that her father destroyed another family. Richard reached out and took Margaret's hand. You saved Emma's life that night. And you've given her 8 years of love and stability that she never would have had otherwise. You have nothing to feel guilty about. But your daughter, my daughter, is gone, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. And nothing can bring her back. But Emma is here, and she's alive, and she needs us both now. Margaret squeezed his hand tightly. What are you saying, Richard? Before Richard could answer, Emma's voice echoed from the hallway, singing a cheerful song as she returned with ice cream. Richard and Margaret looked at each other, both understanding that their conversation was about to take a direction that would change all of their lives forever. We'll talk more later, Richard whispered as Emma bounced back into the room. I got chocolate for everyone, Emma announced happily, completely unaware of the earth-shattering conversation that had just taken place. Nana Maggie, you look sad. Are you feeling worse? Margaret forced a smile and patted her bed. No, sweetheart. Actually, I think I might be feeling a little bit better. 3 days later, Richard found himself pacing the marble floors of his mansion study, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. He'd spent every waking hour at the hospital, officially as Emma's friend, but in reality learning every detail about the remarkable little girl who had somehow become the center of his universe. His lawyer Marcus sat across from his mahogany desk, thick folders spread between them containing the complete investigation into David Parker's disappearance. The trail goes cold in Mexico, Marcus explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. David Parker crossed the border 8 years ago and vanished completely. No passport activity, no credit card usage, no contact with any known associates. He's either dead or living completely off the grid. Richard stared out the window toward the garden where Sarah used to play. What about his military records? His psychological evaluations? Severe PTSD, multiple recommended treatments that he refused. 3 DUIs in the 2 years before the accident, all dismissed due to technicalities. The man was clearly in crisis, but the system failed him completely. And Emma's legal status? Marcus shuffled through another folder. Margaret Thompson has full legal custody. She's listed as Emma's emergency contact, primary guardian, and sole beneficiary of a small life insurance policy Jennifer had through her work. But Richard. Marcus paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. What is it? Margaret's medical prognosis is worse than she's letting Emma know. According to my contact at the hospital, she has maybe 6 weeks left, 8 at the outside. Without the experimental treatment, she'll be gone within the month. Richard's heart clenched. And if she dies? Emma becomes a ward of the state. She'll go into foster care, probably separated from everything familiar. Given her age and the circumstances, adoption would be. Marcus trailed off, clearly not wanting to voice the grim statistics. Unlikely, Richard finished quietly. I have to ask, Richard. What exactly are you planning here? I know you've been spending every day at that hospital, and Emma clearly adores you. But getting emotionally involved with the daughter of the man who killed Sarah. It's not healthy. It's not rational. Richard turned from the window, his decision crystallizing. Marcus, I want you to draw up adoption papers. Richard, no. Absolutely not. You can't adopt a child as some kind of penance or misguided attempt to replace Sarah. It doesn't work that way. This isn't about replacing Sarah. Richard said firmly. This is about Emma. She's an innocent child who's about to lose the only family she's ever known. I have the resources to give her everything she needs: stability, education, love. Love? Marcus stood up, his professional composure cracking. Richard, you've known this child for 3 days. You can't love someone you barely know, especially when she's connected to the worst tragedy of your life. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Do you know what Emma did yesterday? Marcus shook his head. She drew me a picture of my daughter. Marcus's expression softened. What do you mean? She'd never seen a photo of Sarah, never heard her name before 3 days ago. But she drew a picture of a little girl with brown hair and blue eyes, playing with a teddy bear that looked exactly like Mr. Button's. When I asked her about it, she said she'd been having dreams about a sad little girl who wanted her teddy bear to be happy again. Marcus sank back into his chair. Richard, I'm not trying to replace Sarah, Richard continued. But I think maybe Sarah led me to Emma. Maybe this is all connected in ways we don't understand. That little girl is going to lose her grandmother, just like I lost my daughter. But I can make sure she doesn't lose everything. And if David Parker ever comes back, then we'll deal with it. But Margaret says he's been gone for 8 years without a word. He abandoned Emma, Marcus. He left her to be raised by an elderly woman on a fixed income while he ran from his responsibilities. Marcus gathered his papers slowly. This is going to be complicated. Margaret will have to consent to the adoption, assuming she lives long enough. You'll need to undergo home studies, psychological evaluations, background checks. And Richard, Emma will eventually need to know the truth about who you are and how you're connected to her father. I know. And I'll tell her when she's old enough to understand. What if she hates you for it? What if she blames you for her father disappearing? Richard considered this, his heart heavy with the possibility. Then I'll accept that. But at least she'll be safe and loved, and she'll have opportunities her father never gave her. Marcus nodded slowly. I'll start the paperwork. But Richard, promise me you'll think this through completely. Once you start this process, there's no going back. Emma will become your responsibility, legally and emotionally, for the rest of your life. I've never been more certain of anything, Richard replied. That evening, Richard returned to the hospital to find Emma curled up in the chair beside Margaret's bed, reading aloud from a worn copy of Charlotte's Web. Margaret's eyes were closed, but she was smiling peacefully as Emma's sweet voice filled the room. And Charlotte said salutations, which means hello in fancy talk. Emma read carefully, sounding out the bigger words. That's beautiful, sweetheart, Richard said softly from the doorway. Emma looked up with a bright smile. Mr. Richard. Nana Maggie's been sleeping a lot today, but the nurses said reading to her still helps. Do you want to hear the story too? Richard settled into the other chair, and Emma climbed into his lap with the naturalness of a child who had already decided to trust him completely. As she continued reading, Margaret opened her eyes and looked directly at Richard. We need to talk, she mouthed silently. Richard nodded, understanding that Margaret had made her own decision about Emma's future. Later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep curled up between them on Margaret's hospital bed, Margaret and Richard spoke in hushed whispers about the impossible situation they found themselves in. I'm dying, Richard, Margaret said simply. And Emma doesn't know how bad it really is. I've been trying to protect her, but she's going to need someone when I'm gone. I want to adopt her, Margaret. I want to give her everything she deserves. Margaret was quiet for a long time, studying Richard's face in the dim hospital lighting. Why? She finally asked. Why would you want to take in the daughter of the man who destroyed your life? Richard looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully with Mr. Buttons clutched against her chest. Because she's not responsible for what her father did. Because she's already lost too much. And because... He paused, struggling to put his feelings into words. Because when I look at her, I don't see David Parker's daughter. I see a little girl who needs a father, and I see a chance to maybe do something good with all this pain. Margaret reached out and squeezed his hand. There's something else you need to know about Emma. Something even she doesn't know yet. Richard's heart stopped. What do you mean? Margaret's voice dropped to barely a whisper. David left something else behind besides that teddy bear. Something that changes everything about Emma's connection to your family. Margaret's words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Richard's pulse hammered in his ears as he waited for her to continue, afraid to even breathe. Emma slept peacefully between them, completely unaware that her entire world was about to shift on its axis once again. What are you talking about, Margaret? Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. Margaret carefully reached into her bedside drawer and pulled out a manila envelope, yellowed with age and handling. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing several documents and a letter written in David Parker's distinctive handwriting. David left this for me the night before he disappeared, Margaret said softly. He made me promise not to open it unless something happened to him, or unless Emma was in danger. When you told me who you were 3 days ago, I knew it was time. Richard's hands shook as Margaret handed him the letter. The date at the top was from 8 years ago, just days after the accident that killed Sarah. Margaret, the letter began. If you're reading this, then I'm either dead or I've done something so terrible that I can never come back. I need you to know the truth about that night, and about Emma, because she deserves to know who she really is. The accident wasn't random. I was driving to meet someone, Sarah Wellington's father, Richard Wellington. He'd been trying to find me since the accident, not for revenge like I thought, but because he discovered something about Sarah's blood type that didn't match his medical records. Richard suspected that Sarah wasn't his biological daughter, and he wanted a paternity test. He tracked me down because Jennifer had worked at the same hospital where Sarah was born, and there were questions about babies being switched in the maternity ward around that time. Margaret, I need you to understand, I never meant to hurt anyone. I was drunk and terrified about what the DNA test might reveal. I was supposed to meet Richard that night to provide a sample, but I panicked. I thought if Sarah wasn't really his daughter, somehow that would make what I'd done even worse. That I never told you this before, but Jennifer confessed something to me right before she died. She said there had been a mix-up at the hospital when the girls were born. She was too scared to say anything earlier, but she made me promise to find out the truth. That I've been carrying this secret, and I can't anymore. Margaret, Emma might not be my biological daughter. And if she's not mine, there's a chance she might be Richard Wellington's. Richard's vision blurred as the words sank in. His hands began to shake so violently that he nearly dropped the letter. Margaret reached out and steadied him, her own eyes filled with tears. Keep reading, she whispered. There's more. Richard forced himself to continue, his heart pounding so hard he was sure it would wake Emma. I took some of Sarah's hair from the accident scene and some of Emma's from her baby brush. I had a friend run a DNA test before I left town. The results are in this envelope. Margaret, if Emma is really Richard Wellington's daughter, then the little girl I killed was actually mine. Which means I killed my own biological child and abandoned his. I can't live with this knowledge. I can't face either of them. If the test proves what I suspect, then you need to make sure Emma finds her way back to her real father. He's a good man who has suffered enough, and she deserves to know her true family. I'm sorry for everything. Take care of our girls, whichever daughter belongs to whom. David. Richard's world spun violently as he set down the letter with trembling hands. Margaret silently handed him a sealed envelope marked DNA results, confidential. I've never opened it, Margaret whispered. I was too afraid of what it might say. But now, with you here, wanting to adopt Emma, maybe it's time we knew the truth. Richard stared at the envelope, his mind reeling. Was it possible that the daughter of his heart wasn't his biological child, while the little girl sleeping peacefully beside him was actually his own flesh and blood? Was it possible that David Parker had killed his own daughter while abandoning Richard's? If this is true, Richard said hoarsely, then Emma is your daughter. Margaret finished. And Sarah was David's. The girls were switched at birth, and neither family knew until it was too late. Richard looked down at Emma, really looked at her, and suddenly details he dismissed before came flooding back. Her dimpled chin that matched his own. The way she tilted her head when she was thinking, exactly like he did. Her love of drawing and her meticulous attention to detail, traits that had nothing to do with David Parker but everything to do with Richard's own personality. "Oh my God!" Richard breathed. "Emma is my daughter. My biological daughter." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I think so. I've suspected it for years, but I was too afraid to investigate. She doesn't look anything like David or Jennifer, but she has your eyes, your mannerisms, even your stubborn determination." Richard's entire understanding of the past 8 years crumbled and rebuilt itself in seconds. He hadn't just randomly found David Parker's abandoned daughter. He had found his own child, raised by strangers while he grieved for a little girl who was never really his. But Sarah had been his in every way that mattered. He had loved her, raised her, been her father in all the ways that counted. And Emma. Emma was his biological daughter, but David Parker's father in all the ways that had shaped her. "We need to open it," Richard said, his voice stronger now. "We need to know for certain." Margaret nodded and carefully tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of laboratory results. Richard's eyes scanned the technical language until he found the conclusion. Probability of paternity between David M. Parker and subject A, Emma Thompson. 0.02% probability of paternity between Richard J. Wellington and subject A, Emma Thompson. 99.97%. The results were definitive. Emma was Richard Wellington's biological daughter, and by process of elimination, Sarah had been David Parker's. Richard sank back in his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the revelation. For 8 years he had mourned the wrong child while his real daughter grew up believing her father had abandoned her. Emma stirred in her sleep, unconsciously reaching for Richard's hand. Even in sleep, she sought comfort from her biological father, a father she had never known she belonged to. "What do we do now?" Margaret whispered. Richard looked at this brave woman who had raised his daughter with such love and devotion, and then down at Emma, who had no idea that her entire identity was about to change. "No," Richard said quietly. "We figure out how to tell her that everything she thought she knew about her family was wrong. And we pray that love is stronger than biology, because no matter what that test says, you're still her grandmother in every way that matters." But even as he spoke, Richard's mind was racing with the implications. Emma wasn't just a child he wanted to adopt out of kindness. She was his own daughter, coming home at last. The question now was whether she would want him as her father, once she learned the truth about the man she'd always believed was her dad. 2 weeks had passed since the DNA revelation, and Richard found himself sitting in a small Chicago diner at 6 a.m., staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from him sat Dr. Patricia Hayes, a child psychologist whom Marcus had recommended for help navigating the impossible conversation that lay ahead. "There's no perfect way to tell a 7-year-old that everything she believes about her identity is wrong," Dr. Hayes said gently. "But Emma is remarkably resilient, and she already trusts you completely. That's going to be crucial." Richard ran his hands through his hair, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "How do I tell her that the father she's been missing her whole life actually killed the little girl she was switched with at birth? How do I explain that I'm her real father, but that I've been mourning another man's daughter for 8 years? You tell her the truth, but you do it slowly, with love, and with Margaret's help. Children are more adaptable than we give them credit for, especially when they feel secure in their relationships." Richard's phone buzzed with a text from the hospital. "Margaret asking for you. Please come soon. Nurse Jennifer." Dr. Hayes noticed his expression change. "Is everything okay?" "Margaret's getting worse. Emma doesn't know how serious it is, but I think Margaret wants to tell her about the DNA results before." He couldn't finish the sentence. 20 minutes later, Richard found Margaret sitting up in her hospital bed, more alert than she'd been in days. Emma was at school, giving them time to talk privately. "I've been thinking about our conversation all night," Margaret said without preamble. "We need to tell Emma the truth today. All of it. Are you sure she's ready?" Margaret's laugh was weak but determined. "Richard, that little girl has handled more loss and disappointment in her 7 years than most adults face in a lifetime. She's stronger than you know. But the truth about David, about what he did, will be devastating, yes. But she deserves to know who her real father is before I'm gone. She deserves to understand that she was never abandoned, that you've been looking for her without knowing it." Richard sat beside her bed, taking her frail hand in his. "How do we do this?" "Together. When she gets here after school, we sit her down and we tell her that we've discovered something amazing about her family. We start with the positive, that she has a father who loves her and wants her. Then we explain about the hospital mix-up, gently. And David?" Margaret's expression hardened slightly. "We tell her that the man she thought was her father was very sick in his mind, and that he made terrible choices that hurt people. But we also tell her that he loved her enough to make sure she stayed with me that night, even if he didn't understand why." At 3:30 p.m., Emma burst into the hospital room with her usual exuberance, her backpack flying behind her and her blonde hair in wild disarray. "Nana Maggie! Mr. Richard! Guess what happened at school today?" She climbed carefully onto Margaret's bed, chattering about her art project and a new friend named Katie. Richard's heart clenched as he watched her animated face, knowing that her innocent joy was about to be shaken to its core. "Emma, sweetheart," Margaret said gently, "Mr. Richard and I need to talk to you about something very important. Something about your family." Emma's expression immediately grew serious. At 7 years old, she'd already learned that important family talks usually meant bad news. "Is it about my daddy? Did something happen to him?" Richard and Margaret exchanged glances. This was it, the moment that would change everything. "Emma," Richard said softly, "what would you say if I told you that we discovered something wonderful about your family? Something that means you're even more special than we already knew?" Emma tilted her head thoughtfully. "Like what?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Sweetheart, do you remember when we talked about how sometimes the doctors at hospitals make mistakes?" Emma nodded. "Well, when you were born, the doctors made a very special kind of mistake. They accidentally gave you to the wrong family at first." Emma's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Richard leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Emma, honey, it turns out that you're not David Parker's daughter. You're my daughter. My biological daughter." The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Margaret's monitors. Emma stared at Richard with those brilliant green eyes, processing information that would be difficult for an adult to understand. But if I'm your daughter," Emma said slowly, "then where's your other little girl? The one in the pictures at your house?" Richard's throat tightened. Emma had noticed Sarah's photographs during their visits to his mansion to discuss the adoption plans. "Emma," Margaret said gently, "Sarah was your daddy David's real daughter. The doctors switched you two when you were babies, and nobody knew until now." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her 7-year-old mind working through the implications. "So Sarah was my sister? Kind of?" "In a way, yes," Richard said. "You were both born on the same day, in the same hospital. You grew up in each other's families. Where is she now? Can I meet her?" This was the moment Richard had been dreading. He knelt down beside Margaret's bed so he was at Emma's eye level. "Emma, sweetheart, Sarah died when she was 7 years old. There was a very bad car accident." Emma's face crumpled with immediate grief for a sister she'd never known. "She died? But she was just a little girl like me." "Yes, she was. And she was very loved, just like you are." Emma was quiet for several minutes, tears streaming down her cheeks. When she finally spoke, Her question broke Richard's heart. Was my daddy David driving the car that hurt Sarah? Richard and Margaret looked at each other, knowing there was no way to soften this blow. Yes, Emma, Margaret said quietly. David was driving the car. He was very sick in his mind, and he'd been drinking alcohol, which made him make very bad choices. Emma's sobs were heartbreaking. So my daddy killed my sister? Emma, Richard said urgently, gathering her into his arms. David Parker wasn't your real daddy. I am. And yes, he made a terrible mistake that hurt our family very badly. But you are not responsible for what he did. You are innocent and perfect and loved. Emma clung to Richard with desperate strength. I don't understand. If you're my real daddy, why didn't you come find me before? Why did I have to live without a daddy for so long? Because I didn't know you existed, sweetheart. I thought Sarah was my daughter, and I thought you were David's. Nobody knew about the mix-up until now. Emma pulled back to look at him, her face streaked with tears. But you know now? Yes. And now I want to be your daddy forever, if you'll let me. I want to take care of you and love you and make sure you never feel alone again. Emma looked between Richard and Margaret, her young mind struggling to process the enormity of what she'd learned. Does this mean I don't have to go to foster care when Nana Maggie goes to heaven? The simple question revealed that Emma understood far more about Margaret's condition than the adults had realized. That's right, sweetheart, Margaret said through her own tears. Richard is going to adopt you officially, which means you'll be his daughter legally too. You'll have a real family again. Emma was quiet for a long time, still nestled in Richard's arms. When she finally spoke, her words surprised them both. I'm sad about Sarah. And I'm confused about David. But I'm happy that you're my real daddy, because I love you already. Richard held her tighter, overwhelmed by her resilience and capacity for love despite everything she'd endured. But as Emma fell asleep in his arms an hour later, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't told her the whole truth yet. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a terrible thought was forming about David Parker's 8-year disappearance, and what might happen if he ever decided to come back. 3 days after the revelation, Richard found himself in the cramped office of Detective Maria Santos, who had worked Sarah's case 8 years ago. The walls were covered with case files, crime scene photos, and a large map of Chicago marked with red pins. I've been expecting this call for years, Detective Santos said, leaning back in her worn chair. The David Parker case never sat right with me. A man kills a child in a drunk driving accident, posts bail, and then vanishes completely? That doesn't happen without help. Richard studied the case files spread across her desk. What do you mean, help? Someone with resources helped David Parker disappear. The timeline is too clean, too professional. He crossed into Mexico within 24 hours of skipping bail, had a new identity, cash, everything set up in advance. You think someone paid for his escape? Detective Santos nodded grimly. I think someone wanted David Parker gone as much as he wanted to disappear. The question is who and why. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Emma asking difficult questions about David. Can you come? I have to go, Richard said, standing. But Detective Santos, I need to know, is there any chance David Parker could come back? Any reason he might try to contact Emma? The detective's expression grew troubled. That's what worries me, Mr. Wellington. If David Parker has been living off the grid for 8 years, something significant would have to happen to make him risk exposure. And with Margaret Thompson dying, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Richard understood the implication perfectly. An hour later, Richard found Emma sitting quietly in Margaret's hospital room, coloring in a book but clearly distracted. Margaret appeared to be sleeping, but her breathing was more labored than usual. Hey, sweetheart, Richard said softly, settling into the chair beside Emma. How are you feeling today? Emma looked up with eyes that seemed older than her 7 years. I keep thinking about my real daddy David. Not you, you're my daddy now. But the other one. Richard's heart clenched. What about him? Nana Maggie says he was sick in his mind, but I keep wondering. If he loved me enough to give me Mr. Buttons, why didn't he love me enough to stay? The innocent question cut deep. How could Richard explain the complexities of PTSD, addiction, and psychological breakdown to a 7-year-old? Sometimes, Emma, when people are very sick emotionally, they think they're protecting the people they love by staying away. David was carrying a lot of pain from the war, and from losing your birth mother. He probably thought you'd be better off without him. But he was wrong, wasn't he? I needed a daddy. Yes, sweetheart. He was very wrong. And I'm sorry you had to grow up without knowing that your real daddy was looking for you all along. Emma set down her crayon and climbed into Richard's lap. Can I ask you something really important? Of course. Are you going to leave me too? When things get hard or scary? Richard's throat tightened with emotion. Never, Emma. I promise you, no matter what happens, I will never leave you. You're my daughter, and I love you more than anything in the world. Emma was quiet for a moment. Even if David comes back? Even if he wants me back? The question hit Richard like a physical blow. Emma, why would you think David might come back? I had a dream last night. A really scary dream. A man was watching me from across the street when I was playing at the park. He looked sad and angry at the same time. And he had the same eyes as me. Richard's blood ran cold. Emma's eyes were Richard's eyes. She'd inherited them from him, not from David Parker. But if she was dreaming about a man with similar features. Emma, in your dream, did the man try to talk to you? No, he just watched. But I felt like he wanted to take me away from you and Nana Maggie. It made me really scared. Richard held her closer, his mind racing. Children's dreams were often just their subconscious processing fears and emotions. But given everything that had happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's dream might be more than imagination. Margaret stirred in her bed, her eyes opening slowly. Richard? Is everything okay? We're fine, he said quickly, not wanting to worry her. Emma was just telling me about a dream she had. But Margaret's expression grew alert. What kind of dream? Before Emma could answer, Margaret's nurse appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mrs. Thompson, there's a man here asking about Emma. He says he's her father. The room fell silent except for the sound of Margaret's heart monitor, which began beeping rapidly. What did he look like? Richard asked urgently. Tall, dark hair, thin. He seemed nervous, agitated. He didn't have ID, but he knew Emma's full name, her birthday, even details about her birth that wouldn't be public knowledge. Richard stood quickly, pulling Emma behind him protectively. Where is he now? Security escorted him to the lobby. He's asking to see Emma, but given that you're listed as her legal guardian now, we couldn't allow it without permission. Emma's face had gone pale. Is it David? Is it really him? Margaret struggled to sit up, her breathing labored. Richard, you need to handle this carefully. If David's back, there's a reason. And it might not be what we think. I don't want to see him, Emma said quietly, pressing closer to Richard. I want to stay with you. Richard's protective instincts surged. You don't have to see him, sweetheart. Not if you don't want to. But even as he spoke, Richard knew this moment had been inevitable. David Parker was back, 8 years after destroying both their lives. The question was what he wanted, and how far Richard would have to go to protect Emma from the man who had abandoned her. Should I call security to remove him? The nurse asked. Richard looked down at Emma, then at Margaret, who was struggling to stay conscious. A decision had to be made, and it had to be made now. No, Richard said finally. I'll go talk to him. But Emma stays here with security watching the room. As Richard headed toward the elevator, he couldn't shake the feeling that the next few minutes would determine Emma's future, and whether the fragile family they'd built together would survive David Parker's return. The hospital elevator descended with agonizing slowness as Richard prepared himself to face the man who had haunted his nightmares for 8 years. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs with each passing floor. Whatever David Parker wanted, Richard was determined to protect Emma at all costs. The lobby was bustling with typical hospital activity: visitors, staff, patients in wheelchairs. But Richard spotted David immediately. He was sitting alone in a corner chair, his head in his hands, looking nothing like the monster Richard had imagined for so long. David Parker was thin to the point of gauntness, his dark hair streaked with premature gray. His clothes were clean but worn, and his hands shook with what might have been withdrawal, anxiety, or simply exhaustion. When he looked up and saw Richard approaching, his face crumpled with an expression of such profound remorse that Richard almost stopped walking. "Richard Wellington," David said, rising from his chair with obvious effort. I wasn't sure you'd come down." "What do you want, David?" Richard's voice was controlled, but there was steel beneath the surface. "I want to see my daughter." David's voice cracked. "I know I have no right, but I need to see Emma before." "Before what?" David's eyes filled with tears. "Before I turn myself in. I've been running for 8 years, living with what I did to your family, to my own family. I can't run anymore." Richard studied David's face, looking for deception, manipulation, any sign that this was some kind of trick. But all he saw was a broken man consumed by guilt and desperation. "You abandoned Emma," Richard said quietly. "You left her to be raised by her grandmother while you ran from your responsibilities. What could you possibly have to say to her now?" "I know what I did was unforgivable," David whispered. "But I need her to know that I never stopped loving her. That every day I stayed away was because I thought she was better off without me." "She was better off without you," Richard said harshly. "Do you have any idea what she's been through? Margaret is dying, David. Emma is 7 years old, and she's about to lose the only parent she's ever known." David's face went white. "Margaret is dying? Cancer. She has maybe 2 weeks left. Emma doesn't even know how serious it is yet." David sank back into his chair as if his legs couldn't support him. "Oh God. I came back because I heard through contacts that Margaret was sick, but I didn't know. I thought I had time to make things right." "Make things right?" Richard's control was slipping. "You killed my daughter, David. You drove drunk and you killed an innocent child." "I know," David sobbed. "I know what I did. But Richard, there's something else you need to know. Something about that night that I never told anyone." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" David looked around the lobby nervously, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The accident wasn't random. I was being followed that night. Someone wanted me to crash." "That's impossible." "You were drunk." "Yes, I was drunk. But I wasn't that drunk when I left the house. Someone spiked my drink at the bar earlier that evening. And there was a car following me, forcing me to drive faster, to take routes I didn't know." Richard stared at David, unable to process what he was hearing. "You're saying someone deliberately caused the accident?" "I'm saying someone wanted me to crash that night, and they didn't care who else got hurt. I've spent 8 years trying to figure out who and why. This is insane. You're trying to blame someone else for your choices." "No." David's voice cracked with desperation. "I'm not trying to escape responsibility. I got behind the wheel drunk, and I killed your daughter. That's on me forever. But Richard, I think someone set us both up that night." "Who? Who would do that?" David pulled a worn manila envelope from his jacket. "I've been investigating for years, using contacts from my military days. Look at this." Richard reluctantly took the envelope. Inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance reports. "Someone's been watching both our families for years," David continued. "Even before the accident. These photos show men following Margaret and Emma, following you and Sarah. Someone with resources, with connections." Richard's hands shook as he flipped through the photographs. There were indeed pictures of his family, of Emma and Margaret, taken from a distance with telephoto lenses. The dates spanned several years. I don't understand. Why would someone want to hurt our families? I think it has to do with the hospital where the girls were born. I think someone knew about the mix-up and was using it for leverage somehow. But I never found out who or why before I had to run. Richard's mind raced. If David was telling the truth, then everything he believed about the accident was wrong. But it seemed impossible to believe that someone had orchestrated such an elaborate scheme. Even if this is true, Richard said slowly, it doesn't change anything. You still drove drunk. You still killed my daughter. I know. And I'm ready to face the consequences. But Richard, if I'm right, then whoever did this is still out there. And if they know about the DNA test results, if they know you found Emma. David didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication was terrifying. Richard's phone buzzed with an urgent text. Richard, come back now. Something's wrong with Emma. Nurse, I have to go, Richard said, standing abruptly. Please, David called after him. Just let me see her once. Let me apologize. Let me tell her I love her before I turn myself in. Richard paused at the elevator, torn between his protective instincts and a growing sense that there were layers to this story he didn't understand. I'll think about it, he said finally. But David, if you're lying about any of this, if you're trying to manipulate your way back into Emma's life. I'm not, David said firmly. I just want to make peace with my daughter before I spend the rest of my life in prison. As the elevator doors closed, Richard found himself believing David Parker for the first time in 8 years. But that belief brought with it a terrifying new possibility, that Emma might still be in danger from the same people who had destroyed their families 8 years ago. Richard burst into Margaret's hospital room to find chaos. Emma was sobbing hysterically while 2 nurses tried to calm her down. Margaret was unconscious, surrounded by medical equipment that was beeping urgently. What happened? Richard demanded, immediately gathering Emma into his arms. Emma started screaming about 20 minutes ago. Nurse Jennifer explained. She said she saw a man outside the window watching her, but we're on the 3rd floor. Security checked the area but found nothing. Emma clung to Richard with desperate strength. Daddy, I saw him. The man from my dreams. He was standing on the fire escape looking at me through the window. Richard's blood turned to ice. If David was telling the truth about being watched, then Emma might actually be in danger. We're leaving, Richard said decisively. Now. Mr. Wellington, Mrs. Thompson's condition is critical. She may not have much time left. Richard looked at Margaret's unconscious form, his heart breaking. But Emma's safety had to come first. Call me the moment she wakes up, he said, then turned to Emma. Sweetheart, we need to go to my house where you'll be safe. 30 minutes later, Richard paced the living room of his mansion, while Emma sat curled up on the couch with Mr. Buttons, still shaken by what she'd seen. His head of security, James Morrison, was reviewing surveillance footage from the hospital. There's definitely someone on that fire escape, James reported grimly. Male, medium build, wearing dark clothing. He was there for approximately 15 minutes before disappearing. Richard's phone rang. It was Detective Santos. Mr. Wellington, we need to talk immediately. David Parker's story about being followed the night of the accident? He might be telling the truth. What do you mean? I've been digging deeper into the case files, and I found some irregularities that were overlooked at the time. Traffic cameras show a second vehicle following Parker's car that night, but the footage was mysteriously corrupted before we could enhance it. Richard sank into a chair. So someone really was orchestrating this? It's looking that way. And Mr. Wellington, there's something else. The hospital where both girls were born. It was owned by a subsidiary of a larger corporation. That corporation was recently acquired by Wellington Industries. The world seemed to stop spinning. That's impossible. I would never have approved an acquisition of anything connected to Richard's voice trailed off as the implications hit him. Someone within his own company might have known about the hospital connection all along. Detective Santos, I need you to come to my house immediately. And bring everything you have on this case. After hanging up, Richard called his lawyer Marcus with trembling hands. Marcus, I need you to pull all records of any hospital acquisitions we've made in the past 5 years. Specifically look for anything connected to Chicago General Medical Center. Richard, what's this about? Just do it. And Marcus, I need you to run background checks on every board member, every senior executive, anyone who would have had access to acquisition information. Emma looked up from her coloring book with worried eyes. Daddy, why do you look so scared? Richard forced a smile and sat beside her on the couch. I'm not scared, sweetheart. I'm just trying to solve a puzzle about some bad people who might have hurt our family. The same bad people who made David crash his car? Richard's breath caught. For a 7-year-old, Emma had an unsettling grasp of the situation. Maybe, sweetheart. But you don't need to worry about that. Daddy's going to keep you safe. An hour later, Detective Santos arrived with a thick file of case documents. James Morrison had also discovered something troubling in the mansion's security system. Mr. Wellington, James reported, I found evidence that our security cameras have been accessed remotely multiple times over the past month. Someone's been watching the house. Detective Santos spread crime scene photos across Richard's dining room table. Here's what we know. David Parker was definitely intoxicated the night of the accident, but his blood alcohol level was higher than it should have been based on his reported consumption. Someone spiked his drinks. She pulled out a traffic camera photo that was barely visible due to corruption. This vehicle was following Parker for at least 12 blocks before the accident. The license plate is obscured, but we can make out part of a corporate logo on the side. Richard squinted at the image. Something about the logo seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. There's more. Detective Santos continued. I spoke with nurses who worked at Chicago General when both girls were born. 3 of them remember being told to keep quiet about babies being moved between rooms that night. They were told it was for security reasons. Security reasons? Someone with authority at the hospital ordered the baby swap. It wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. Richard's mind reeled. But why? What would anyone gain from switching the babies? Marcus burst through the front door without knocking, his face pale and urgent. Richard, we need to talk privately. Now. They stepped into Richard's study, closing the door behind them. What did you find? Richard asked. Marcus pulled out a thick folder. Chicago General Medical Center was acquired through a shell company 3 years ago. The ultimate parent company is Blackstone Holdings, which is owned by. Marcus paused, clearly struggling with what he had to say. Owned by whom, Marcus? Your father-in-law, Richard. Emma's grandfather. Harold Blackstone. The room spun around Richard as the impossible truth hit him. Harold Blackstone, his ex-wife's father, the man who had blamed Richard for their daughter's death, the man who had sworn revenge against him for surviving the accident that killed Sarah. Harold knew about the baby swap all along. Richard whispered. He orchestrated the entire thing. It gets worse, Marcus said grimly. I found email communications between Harold and several employees at the hospital. They were planning to use the switched identities for some kind of insurance fraud. But when the accident happened and Sarah died, Harold realized he could use the situation to destroy you emotionally instead. Richard staggered backward. He's been manipulating everything for 8 years. He knew Emma was my biological daughter, and he let me grieve for Sarah while Emma grew up in poverty. Richard, there's one more thing. Harold Blackstone is in Chicago. He arrived 2 days ago. As if summoned by their conversation, Richard's phone rang. The caller ID showed Harold Blackstone's name. Hello, Richard. Harold's cold voice said when Richard answered. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Harold, what the hell have you done? I've simply been ensuring that justice was served. You destroyed my family, Richard. Now it's time for me to return the favor. Through the study window, Richard saw a black SUV pulling into his driveway. Emma? Richard shouted, running toward the living room, but when he burst through the door, the room was empty. Emma was gone, and Mr. Buttons lay abandoned on the floor. Richard's world collapsed as he stared at the empty living room. Emma's coloring book lay open on the coffee table, crayons scattered as if she'd been grabbed suddenly. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock and Richard's hammering heartbeat. Emma? He shouted again, his voice echoing through the mansion. James Morrison appeared from the kitchen, his face grim. The back door was forced open. Security cameras showed two men in dark clothing. They had a van waiting in the service alley. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Union Station. Track 12. 1 hour. Come alone or Emma disappears forever. Detective Santos was already on her radio calling for backup and an APB on Harold Blackstone. Richard, we'll find her. But you can't go to that meeting alone. Like hell I can't, Richard said, grabbing his car keys. Harold has my daughter. I'm not taking any chances with her life. Marcus grabbed his arm. Richard, think about this logically. Harold orchestrated this entire scheme for 8 years. He's not going to just hand Emma back because you show up. Then what do you suggest? Richard's voice was raw with desperation. Detective Santos looked up from her radio. We position officers throughout Union Station, but keep them out of sight. You go to the meeting, but you're not really alone. Richard's phone rang again. Harold Blackstone's name appeared on the screen. I assume you got my message. Harold's voice was cold and calculating. Where is she, Harold? What do you want? What I've always wanted, Richard. For you to understand what it feels like to lose everything you love. I already lost everything 8 years ago when Sarah died. Harold's laugh was bitter. Sarah was never yours, Richard. She was my granddaughter, my blood. And you let her die in that car while you survived. Now you'll know what it feels like to lose your real child. Harold, please. Emma is innocent in all this. She's just a 7-year-old girl who's already lost too much. Innocence is irrelevant, Richard. You took my granddaughter from me. Now I'm taking yours from you. The line went dead. Richard drove toward Union Station with his hands shaking on the steering wheel. Detective Santos followed in an unmarked car with a team of officers, but Richard felt utterly alone. Emma, his daughter, his flesh and blood, was in the hands of a man consumed by 8 years of grief and revenge. Union Station was crowded with evening commuters and travelers. Richard made his way through the bustling terminal toward Track 12, his eyes scanning every face for signs of Harold or Emma. Track 12 led to a train bound for Denver, departing in 30 minutes. Richard found Harold standing near the boarding gate, looking older and more haggard than Richard remembered. But there was no sign of Emma. Where is she? Richard demanded. Safe for now, Harold replied. But that depends entirely on you. What do you want me to do? Harold pulled out a manila envelope. Inside are documents transferring full custody of Emma to me. Sign them, and she lives. Refuse, and she disappears forever. Richard's heart sank. Harold, you can't seriously want to raise Emma. You're 70 years old, and you're obviously mentally unstable. I don't want to raise her, Harold said coldly. I want to make sure you never see her again. I want you to spend the rest of your life wondering if she's alive or dead, safe or suffering. The same way I've wondered about Sarah every day since you let her die. I didn't let Sarah die. The accident wasn't my fault. You survived and she didn't. That makes it your fault. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of Emma, tied to a chair in what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse, tears streaming down her face. She was holding a newspaper from that day, proving the photo was recent. Sign the papers, Richard, Harold said quietly. Or that's the last photo of your daughter you'll ever see. Richard stared at the custody documents, his mind racing. If he signed them, Harold would have legal authority to take Emma anywhere, to hide her completely. But if he didn't sign them, I need proof that she's unharmed. Richard said. Harold made a phone call. Put her on speaker. Daddy? Emma's terrified voice came through the phone. Daddy, please come get me. I'm scared. Emma, sweetheart, are you hurt? No, but there are bad men here and they won't let me go. They said you don't want me anymore. Richard's heart shattered. That's not true, Emma. I want you more than anything in the world. I'm going to get you, I promise. Harold ended the call. Sign the papers, Richard. Now. Richard looked around the station, hoping to spot Detective Santos or her team. He could see several people who might be undercover officers, but Harold's men could be anywhere with weapons trained on Emma. If I sign these papers, how do I know you'll let her go? You don't, Harold said simply. You'll have to trust me the same way I had to trust that you would protect Sarah 8 years ago. Richard's hands trembled as he picked up the pen. Everything in him screamed not to sign, but Emma's terrified voice echoed in his head. He couldn't risk her life on the hope that the police would find her in time. Just as he was about to sign his name, Richard's phone rang again. It was David Parker. Richard, don't sign anything. I found where they're keeping Emma. Harold's face went white. Who is that? David Parker. Richard said loudly enough for Detective Santos to hear if she was nearby. And he's about to destroy your entire plan. Harold reached into his jacket, but before he could draw whatever weapon he was reaching for, 3 police officers materialized from the crowd, their guns drawn. Harold Blackstone, you're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy, and accessory to vehicular manslaughter, Detective Santos announced. But even as they handcuffed Harold, Richard's mind was on Emma. David, where is she? Abandoned warehouse on the south side. I'm already here with police backup. Richard, she's safe. We're bringing her home. As Harold was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Richard with pure hatred in his eyes. This isn't over, Richard. I'll never stop making you pay for what you took from me. Richard barely heard him. His daughter was safe, and after 8 years of pain and loss, his family was finally going to be whole again. But as he raced toward the warehouse to reunite with Emma, Richard couldn't shake Harold's final words. Men like Harold Blackstone didn't give up easily, and Richard had a feeling this was just the beginning of a much longer battle. The abandoned warehouse on Chicago's south side had been transformed into a crime scene buzzing with police activity. But Richard saw none of it as he ran through the maze of investigators and evidence markers. His only focus was the small figure sitting on the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a police-issued blanket. Emma? Richard called out. She looked up, and despite everything she'd been through, her face lit up with pure joy. Daddy? She cried, jumping down from the ambulance and running into his arms. Richard swept her up, holding her so tightly he was afraid he might hurt her. But Emma clung to him just as desperately, her small body shaking with relief and residual fear. I knew you'd come for me, Emma whispered against his neck. The bad men said you didn't want me anymore, but I knew that wasn't true. Never, Richard said fiercely. I will always come for you, Emma. Always. Over Emma's shoulder, Richard saw David Parker standing awkwardly near a police car, his hands cuffed but his expression filled with relief. Detective Santos approached them. Emma's physically unharmed, she reported. Scared but unharmed. The men who took her are in custody, and they're cooperating fully. Harold's operation is completely dismantled. Richard looked at David, unsure what to say to the man who had both destroyed and saved his family. Thank you, Richard said simply. David nodded, tears in his eyes. She's a brave kid. She never stopped believing you'd find her. Can I say goodbye to her before they take me in? Richard looked down at Emma, who had been listening to the exchange. Emma, David helped save you today. Do you want to say goodbye to him? Emma studied David's face for a long moment. Are you really my birth daddy? The one who gave me Mr. Buttons? Yes. David said quietly. I am. And I'm sorry I couldn't be the father you deserved. Emma wriggled out of Richard's arms and walked over to David. I forgive you, she said simply. Nana Maggie taught me that forgiveness makes your heart lighter. David's composure crumbled completely. Emma, I want you to know that giving you that teddy bear was the last good thing I did before everything went wrong. I loved you then, and I love you now. I know, Emma said. And I love you too. But Richard is my daddy now, and he makes me feel safe. David nodded through his tears. That's all I ever wanted for you, sweetheart. To be safe and loved. As the police led David away, he looked back one final time. Take care of her, Richard. She's the best part of both our families. 3 hours later, Richard and Emma sat in Margaret's hospital room. Margaret was awake but weak, her breathing labored despite the oxygen mask. But her eyes were bright with joy as she held Emma's hand. I was so scared I'd never see you again, my precious girl. Margaret whispered. I'm okay, Nana Maggie. Daddy saved me, just like he promised he would. Margaret looked at Richard with profound gratitude. Thank you for bringing her home. Margaret, Richard said softly, there's something I need to ask you. Something important. Margaret nodded, understanding immediately what he was referring to. Emma, Richard said, kneeling beside the hospital bed. Nana Maggie and I need to talk to you about something very special. We know you've been very brave today, but we need you to be brave one more time. Emma's expression grew serious. What is it? Margaret struggled to sit up higher. Sweetheart, you know that I'm very sick, right? Emma nodded, her eyes filling with tears. The doctors said your body is tired and might need to rest soon. That's right. And when that happens, I won't be able to take care of you anymore. Margaret's voice was gentle but steady. But Emma, that doesn't mean you'll be alone. I know, Emma said quietly. Richard is going to adopt me so I can be his daughter for real. Richard's heart swelled with love for this remarkable little girl. Emma, that's exactly right. But there's something else we want you to know. Something about how much you mean to all of us. Over the next hour, they told Emma the complete story. They explained about the hospital mix-up, about how Sarah had been David's biological daughter while Emma was Richard's. They talked about how love isn't just about blood, but about the people who choose to stay and care for you. Emma listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and processing information that would challenge much older minds. So Sarah was my sister in a way, Emma said finally. And she would have been happy that I found my real daddy? I think she would have loved you very much, Richard said. And I think she would be happy that we found each other. What about Mr. Buttons? Can I still keep him even though he was really Sarah's? Richard smiled through his tears. Emma, Mr. Buttons belongs to you now. Sarah would want you to have him. That night, Richard tucked Emma into the guest bedroom of his mansion, which they had already begun converting into her permanent room. She clutched Mr. Buttons tightly, but for the first time since he'd known her, she seemed truly at peace. Daddy? Emma said as Richard turned off the light. Yes, sweetheart? I'm sad about Nana Maggie getting sicker. And I'm sad that David made bad choices. But I'm happy that we found each other. Me too, Emma. Me too. 2 weeks later, Margaret Thompson passed away peacefully in her sleep with Richard and Emma holding her hands. Her final words were to tell Emma to remember that love never really dies. It just changes form and keeps growing in new hearts. The funeral was small but filled with love. Emma stood between Richard and David, who had been granted permission to attend while awaiting sentencing, and sang Amazing Grace, in a voice pure and clear enough to make angels weep. After the service, David knelt down to Emma's level one last time. I have to go away for a long time, he told her. I have to pay for the mistakes I made. But I want you to know that helping save you was the most important thing I've ever done. Will you write me letters? Emma asked. If your daddy says it's okay. Emma looked at Richard, who nodded. I think that would be fine, as long as the letters are appropriate. Thank you, David said to Richard, for giving her the life I couldn't. 6 months later, Richard stood in the garden of his mansion watching Emma play on the swing set he'd had installed. She was laughing with pure joy, her blonde hair flying in the wind, Mr. Button safely tucked in her jacket pocket. Marcus approached with a thick folder. The final adoption papers are complete, he announced. Emma is officially Emma Wellington now. Richard smiled, but his attention remained on his daughter. She had healed remarkably over the past months, her natural resilience and capacity for love shining through despite everything she'd endured. Daddy! Emma called out. Come push me on the swings! As Richard walked toward his daughter, he thought about the journey that had brought them together. Loss and love, tragedy and triumph, all woven together in ways that defied understanding. Emma wasn't a replacement for Sarah, no one could be that. But she was something equally precious, his daughter coming home at last. Harold Blackstone was serving life in prison for kidnapping and conspiracy. David Parker had been sentenced to 15 years but was receiving the psychological help he should have gotten years earlier. The truth about the hospital switch had been revealed, bringing closure to both families. But most importantly, Emma was safe, loved, and home where she belonged. That evening, as Richard read Emma a bedtime story, she looked up at him with those brilliant green eyes that had captured his heart from the very first moment. Daddy, do you think people find their way to each other for a reason? Richard thought about the question carefully. I think sometimes the hardest journeys lead us to exactly where we're supposed to be. I think so too, Emma said sleepily. I think me and you were always meant to be a family. We just had to wait for the right time to find each other. As Emma drifted off to sleep, Richard realized she was absolutely right. Love had brought them through darkness into light, through loss into healing, through separation into reunion. They were finally home, not just in a house, but in each other's hearts, where they had always belonged.